Audio by Raising Free People Network.
You can't keep using tools of oppression and expect to raise free people.
Peace and love. Welcome to episode 220 of Fear of the Free Child podcast. This is Akila, and this is part 1 of 3 with Iris Chen. Iris Chen is the chief writer over at Untigering.com, and she is a self-described recovering overachiever who's unschooling her kids and herself. Iris and I actually had this conversation before her book even came out, and we will talk about her book. We talked in early November of last year, of 2020. And since then, of course, so much has happened, including the successful release of Iris's book, Untigering, Peaceful Parenting for the Deconstructing Tiger Parent. After the release of Iris's book, right here in Georgia, the Atlanta spa murders happened and was evidence of yet another example of the anti-Asian racism that has been heightened really since this pandemic. So the ignorance manifested as violence and as murder in these cases. And as we have these conversations here on Fear of the Free Child about what we can do as parents and educators and village members to name, to work through, and to shift the pervasiveness of multiple isms, we also deal with them ourselves, right? And we don't always have the answers on how we can keep our children, our people safe while realities like this exist and plague us. And so Iris wrote a blog post back in March of this year, shortly after the killings, and about ways to talk to our children about anti-Asian racism. And I'll be sure to put the link to that blog post on the show notes page. The show notes page for this episode is raisingfreepeople.com/220. So you're about to hear that conversation that Iris and I had back in November of last year. And it wasn't our first time connecting. Actually, Iris and I met in Cali one year when I went for HSC. Shout out to the Homeschooling Association of California. And when I learned about what Iris does and why, I knew that we would feel it. I knew we would want to hear her here on the podcast. And so I'd spoken to Fatima, my friend and our operations manager, about reaching out to Iris. Let's get Iris on the show. Before we could make that happen, Iris actually reached out to me about her book. And I was like, bet, we already connected. So she sent me a copy of the book last year and I read it. And I said, listen. And you'll hear me say listen just like that a bunch of times during our conversation shortly. So the book is out and popping, and you can get it at untigering.com. And I will put the direct link to the page on her website where you can get the book. You can get a signed copy from Iris through untigering.com. And of course, the book is also available on Amazon. That link will be on the show notes page as well. So please remember that this is part 1 of 3, right? So this one, you're going to hear from Iris, get to meet her if you weren't aware of her work, and hear a little bit about her what and why. Next week, you'll hear feedback. Maybe you'll even hear your own voice if you message me over on raisingfreepeople.com, that little leave a voicemail icon right there. Or you can email me at she@raisingfreepeople.com to give me your feedback about the episode, your insights, your questions, all that, right? And that's what we'll play next week. And then the week after that, on the Saturday, we will play a recap of the field trip because Iris is joining us live to talk about Untigering. So let's listen to the conversation. And then at the end of this episode, I will remind you how to get involved, how to stay involved, and all that good stuff. I have no intention of interviewing Iris Chen to talk about the blah, 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 like at all. I definitely just want to chat because I did get to read your book And my hand was in the air like 3/4 at a time, like, get out my life, Iris. Yes, yes, yes. It is so good. And I'm really grateful that we get to talk about it out loud together.
Awesome. I'm so excited. Yes.
I really want to talk for now from the context of the book. Like, what about your life made it as such that you're writing this book now?
Yeah, I actually started this process about 2 years ago and was really just seeing a dearth in information or resources written for people like me. Like, I am an Asian American. My family experiences, my experience with my parents, growing up as a child of immigrants, it wasn't reflected in any of the parenting literature or resources out there. And so a lot of it, like me starting my blog and everything, was just for me to process my own journey. And yeah, it was really selfish in a way. It was for me, like, I didn't have any thought of like growing an audience or anything. I wasn't writing for anybody else. I was really writing for me. The amazing thing was that people resonated with it and saw their own experience and their own lives reflected in it. And I think that's been the beautiful thing about this journey, is that it's very personal to me. It's like writing my own story. In some ways, it's, yeah, telling my own story and is memoirish in some way.
Yeah. But it's like the element of that is what makes it, it's like why we can relate to it and why it doesn't feel like somebody trying to give us advice or even perspective. It's not a give, it's an offering, it's sharing. It's like, I'm really unraveling this for myself and I'm doing it out loud as much as I can, because that's very much what your book feels like too. And of course, it's familiar waters because you know the deal over here. It's been that too, where it's just like, I don't know. I think I know. Wait, I totally don't know. Do you guys know? How do you experience it?
Exactly. I feel like it's very much a thinking out loud, just as you said. Like, I'm wrestling with these ideas and I'm yeah, thinking about them and I'm sharing them. And people can have pushback and people can disagree. And maybe in a few years, I will disagree with them.
Yeah, maybe in a few minutes. Like, I don't even know.
Yeah.
But I love the element of, though, that it's also specific to you. And when you talk about in the book, you talk about being a person who is multicultural and who grew up in a space where belonging is not going to come from some one nation under God idea. It never actually did. So then this unraveling, this thinking out loud, this feeling out loud is also not out into the ether. It also has these elements of your particular cultural perspectives and lenses, and that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I didn't want to write a book that was going to sort of like cater to the masses and make everyone happy, right? Because that doesn't work. I really wanted to center my own experience, like I said in the book, and to make it relatable through the specifics of my own story. And I'm reading your book right now, and I think the same is true of your story. I'm so glad that you shared your own journey and your own process. It's not just a bunch of ideas out there.
Exactly. And that, I think, is its own contribution. The way that we've written, the way that we've compiled our stories to offer, I think is also its own untigering, its own raising free people, its own deschooling work, because we're not putting together a bunch of ideas and general things. We're saying, even in the book where you write it in your language, so we get to see it. I do the same thing by adding elements of Jamaican patois to say, you look it up, you figure it out. Like, this isn't, and that's not pushback. It's actually quite the opposite. It's just authentic me. And we need actually to be more comfortable with that. And our books contribute to that.
Yes, absolutely. That was something very intentional for me, because at first I wasn't even going to translate it, because some of the vocabulary words, even if you didn't understand it, you could get the gist of it and that was enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not just ready for people who can read Chinese, so I translated it. But it was important for me to share my language and to share the way we communicate with each other, because that's not something that that's part of my experience, right? So I wanted that reflected.
And it's relevant. It's not only relevant like a nice little accent mark or a spice on the thing. It's actually such an important part of why your story can really reach us, because then we get to feel the similarities, like I felt as a Caribbean woman, with a lot of similar ideas of like the piety and our responsibility and what love looked like and what survival looked like and how those things affect parenting and how we vow never to and totally do, and the layers of those things. And when you talked about the specificity of the stories of like, was it Caleb who said he wanted more when y'all were in Thailand? And then that story, listen, Iris, that's when I was like, get out of my life. Oh my God, why is she like speaking my story? Because I was like, so many experiences came to mind when we first started going back to Jamaica with the girls, and the view of them, in a sense, it's like a part of it was like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. They're so like themselves. And then on the other end, it was like, the word we use is brawling, like just wide and broad and taking up all the space. The other thing is that them brawling, and it's like, no, actually, to say that you would like some more is not brawling. It's just like they're expressing a desire. And then you further that by breaking it down to talk to us about like, actually, it's great when they want to do that. And when your son was playing the thing that he was doing and it crumbled, and you modeled something for him, and then it allowed him to just cry and to say that that did make him sad. And it was really so beautiful, Iris. You took us through your life experiences in a way that also took us through ours.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. I think it is like very much in those moments when I'm feeling the tension, actually, like when I am wrestling with my own triggers and my own emotions that actually make it really difficult to allow them to be themselves. But I think it's in those moments where I have to pause and reflect on why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. When you were bringing your kids to Jamaica and they were showing up in ways that made the society uncomfortable, I think the same with me and my experience and with my children living in China or anywhere, and internalizing those expectations, those social expectations, and imposing those on my kids instead of allowing them to really be who they are. And so there's very much an internal struggle that I can relate to. And yet we need to fight against that. We need to be aware of those pressures and to fight against that.
And this is a part of how we do it, is to name it out loud, because in doing so, then we create these resources of conversations, of space for people to recognize that this idea of parenting, particularly for us who are not based in the US, the layers of pressure around academia and educational accomplishment as the route to liberation, as the vindication of all the people before you who made sure you had these things, like, and all that shit is legit. And as we said, it's like, oh, by doing this thing out loud in this way, we give and get the opportunity to say, oh, so all this time when I was focused on how my kid was learning or what they were learning, I didn't even realize all the other things that you lay out in the book so beautifully, chapter by chapter, section by section. These things are actually informing the lens through which I'm viewing my child and my expectations of them, and the narcissism that comes with them as extensions of me. I love that you pointed that out when you talked about the roles in the book, like extension, like, no, they're not extensions of us in that way. So we really get to break those things down and recognize that it ain't even about the damn grades, actually.
Yeah, totally. There's so much to unpack. That's the beautiful thing about unschooling. I think it really has helped me to unravel so much of it's not just about education, like you said, it's really about parenting. It's about living with our kids in freedom and liberation. And the thing about unschooling is because there are peaceful parents and gentle parents out there, but they still are authoritarian regarding education. And once we unpack like, well, why do we do that? There are no more excuses.
And that's what we need to be doing across the board. We need that practice in all spaces. And this is all spaces. It's relationships.
Right, exactly. So knowing that, okay, it's not just in one particular area that we need to practice anti-oppression, it's in our whole lives and in the whole lives of our children.
Yes, exactly. There's actually a section from your book, and I'm just going to read it, Iris, because this version, I don't remember whether you said that this version was edited or not. Basically, I'm going to read it. I was like, oh, like I have all kind of markings all over the PDF of this. All right, so here we go. Growing up, I loved telling others the interesting fact that each of my family members was born in a different country. My dad was born in China, my mom in Vietnam, my older sister in Hong Kong, which was a British colony at the time, I in the US, and my younger brother in Canada. My parents always joked that if they had had another kid, they would have flown out to Australia to give birth. Even though I was born in the States, the reality is that my heart, my values, and my culture are connected to other parts of the world. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, and it was there that I discovered hockey legend Wayne Gretzky first tasted delicious Ukrainian pierogies, began studying French, and learned how to survive minus 20 degrees Celsius winters. Throughout my childhood, I made regular visits to Hong Kong to get in touch with my roots, quote unquote. There, I fell in love with Cantonese culture and experienced my first taste of independence, navigating the MTR and sipping on Vitasoy lemon teas while shopping at Ladies Market. My high school years were spent in small town Americana, where cow tipping was considered a teenage pastime. Despite being the only Chinese American in my class, I was proud of my roots, serving as president of the Asian American Club and wearing a Chiapao to my senior prom long before it became popular for white girls to do so. In contrast, the large college I attended had an undergraduate population that was nearly 40% Asian and was located in one of the most socially liberal cities in the United States. I majored in English with an emphasis on Victorian literature, but my interests were not exclusively Anglophilic. I was also just a few credits shy of minoring in Asian studies. I graduated, got married, and a few years later moved to Northeast China, where I picked up Mandarin Chinese, started a family, and raised my kids in a city of 16 million people. I lived in that city longer than I'd lived anywhere. I share all of this because it shows how I don't belong to just one place, one culture. I'm not confined by any one set of norms and rules. Instead, I hold in my body a vast array of influences, values, experiences, sounds, smells, tastes, and ways of seeing. I am rich in my complexities and paradoxes as a multicultural person. Listen.
It makes me tear up to hear you read it.
Oh, Iris, thank you so much for putting that in there. You said a word, like that's a sermon right there. Just that right there. And I mean, I could go on because my highlight continues. I was just like, okay, people need to buy the book. But it actually goes all the way down to we can be agents of change instead of victims to tradition.
Yes.
That is a sermon. Okay. I wanted to take the opportunity to just like be with you real time around that and for you to just offer us whatever around that right there, because that shit is everything.
Yeah, I think I really wanted to put that in because I wanted to show people that we are whole people, we're complex people. And even though I'm Asian American, like the whatever stereotype that is, that doesn't define who I am. I'm much more complex than that.
Yes.
And that's true of every single person, no matter where you grew up or where you lived, like we're all complex people. And to be able to be free to hold all those different aspects and show up as our whole selves, I think is part of the work that we're trying to do, raising free people. And I think it also challenges the belief that we are trapped by our own culture. So in this book, I challenge a lot of the norms of Chinese culture, Confucianism, and all those things. And just realizing like a person made these things up, a person made up these ideas. And just like a person made up these ideas, we can undo it. And we can be the people to make up new ideas and to live in new ways and to define our experience in different ways instead of assuming like, oh, I'm Chinese American, I have to follow these rules.
Exactly. We get to garden it. We really get to garden through that and say, what are the pieces, as you talked about in the book? It's like, and I talk about that all the time too. Many of us do as we continue to unschool ourselves and with our children, that we can embrace and celebrate and honor the elements of the culture that are in alignment with who we are or who we are becoming even, while at the same time completely rejecting other elements, while at the same time understanding how come and why our parents did what they did, while not fully understanding how come and why they did. All of those things, that dynamic nature of the way that we shape our practices and our language and relationships, they're all relevant.
Yes.
And if we try to ignore some of them or elevate others, as in I am Chinese American, or, I'm a Jamaican, I need to do this or do that. This is just how we do. We have this phrase like, we're like, you got to really see with us because it's been da 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 da. No, you got to really see with us. And then also we got to do better.
Yes. And I think this book for me is both like a celebration of my culture and a challenge to my culture. Just like you said, there are beautiful aspects of our culture that we can pull from moving forward, but there's definitely toxic parts of it too. And that's the beauty of just where we are in history and in our process at this moment, is like we can take those things, we can pack the things that are going to help us in our journey forward. We don't have to take everything.
And it also, I think it's really important that we recognize that we come from a line of this. There have been many, particularly women before us, who have done this sort of cultural celebration and challenge at the same time. And it is out of love, just like with both of our books and our work. It is so much out of love. It's because Caleb and Noah were like, ma'am, no,
right.
This is not okay for me. Marley and Sage were like, I don't know what you're thinking, but this ain't it. Over and over, enough that I started to realize, just over and over and over again. And you talk about that in the book too, about the ways that we can model. And it just reminds me that for us as adults, a lot of the work is like for us to get busy doing a lot of the things that we tend to criticize our children for, because it's from the fear that they won't have the same things that we don't have. And really, that's for us to resolve.
I feel like so much of the work is our own internal work. It really has nothing to do, less to do with our child.
A lot less.
And more to do with us and our own inner child in some ways. Being able to reparent our own inner child so that we can have space to show up for our children in this moment.
Exactly. And to take what they're teaching us, because they're constantly, even there's a section where, another highlight, let me just read it right quick. If success means liking what they do, our children need the freedom to pursue what they like. They need the freedom to dabble, play, and explore. And then it goes on, in these like really detailing some of the ideas that we have around punishment and rewards. Then you move on to say, that's why I don't believe in having kids take violin lessons, join sports teams, or attend language immersion programs without their enthusiastic consent. Consent applies to more than just sex and bodily autonomy. That was another place where I was so grateful that you highlighted that, because that's one of the areas that my daughters had to really work with me on the most. Like, what is your deal with consent? Like, why is that complicated for you? And I'm like, what the hell? What you mean? Because I didn't see it as about consent. That's the thing. I didn't see it. I didn't even consider their consent with certain things because I didn't come from that mindset. And that was one of the things that just never unraveled for me. That shit stayed intact the whole time. So it took my daughters being like, basically asking me to question my own deal with consent, taking the bullet in that moment of whatever the thing was that I was doing and say, okay, what is your deal with consent? That was such a lesson for me. That's how come I started to realize that I didn't even understand what consent meant in the context of actual relationships with people.
Absolutely. And I think that's, again, one of those areas that we compartmentalize, like we can say, okay, you can have consent over what you wear, or over sex or over your food. But then in terms of how they use their mind,
or their time.
Yes. All of that. Like, why do we feel like they don't, like, we still as parents know what's best for them? That's an area of concern that we never question.
We don't. And so therefore we do that in lots of other ways. But so it's like in the details of the relationship with our children, we really get to practice these skills. And so much of it is really about like emotional intelligence and management of our emotions.
Yes, absolutely. And like you said, our kids will continue to challenge us and continue to teach us different areas in which we need to honor them and need to need to watch for their enthusiastic consent, because we might think, yeah, we're doing it, we're honoring them. And then they'll show us another area where it's like, oh, I do feel like I want to control this out of love and because I'm the parent and I know best. But yeah, a lot of that is fear-based and us wanting to control whatever outcome that we are afraid of.
Totally. And how we're seen, like that's the thing too that I loved. You talked about that so much in the book, really about essentially the gaze, and the one that not only is put upon us at some point, but that we then we carry it. And that you talk a lot about like ways to unravel it. A whole section in the book is really about like, what does the work look like? What is it that you can do once you start to recognize these things? And I feel like that's really important, because to name them is really, it's its own work. And then once you name it, the practice, it both needs to be like uniquely designed for your situation, but can also be very much supported by things that people like us share. And I'm glad that you did.
Yeah, it's a whole process. It's a journey. So it's the same thing with anti-racism. We're talking about adultism or the oppression of children. It's like, we're not going to get it perfect. It's about the process. It's about the work that needs to be done. And so for us not to be afraid of failing, not to be afraid of continuing at it, because that's what it's about. It's not about, oh, I'm a perfect parent now, or I have no adultism in my life. Like, that's never going to be true. We need to be humble about it. We need to constantly be willing to grow. And I think that's what it's about.
And that's a skill that's going to apply to everything right now as we are in the midst of, I think, the great unraveling, because all the shit is unraveling by necessity. And oh my God, it's been time. It's the feedback is hard to accept, and without making it about you, because we see this happening in lots of other spaces, the feedback then becomes weaponized. And it's like, nah, bro, like you really just need to listen to what the hell I'm saying. This is an opportunity for you to listen. We get to practice that. We as Black women, we as Asian women, like we also have internalized elements of that same oppression, and the feedback from our children is how we get to see what's really happening. We get to see it. So don't be afraid of the feedback. Just, it's about figuring out what to do with it.
Yes, because so much of it is, I call it parental fragility, just like white fragility, where it becomes about us and our feelings and about wanting to be seen as a good person, and then we get all torn up about it when it's not about that. This is another thing where Sonia Renee Taylor talks about radical self-love. And I think that's where we need to start as parents as well. It's like, we need to be rooted in our love for ourselves and just like, we're secure, we're stable. Like, even if we mess up in our behavior sometimes, it's okay. Like, we are loved, we are worthy. And it's from that place that then we can address our mistakes and the ways that we are behaving in toxic ways to our children. But if we're not stable in that area, then we'll become defensive and we will justify our continued oppression of our children.
And we know what that looks like because we've seen it happen to us in a variety of ways as adults, as the bodies we walk around in, the countries that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
We see all of these things. And so again, it's an opportunity to remove those compartments from the ways we tend to look at liberation and oppression and our role in it. And now's the time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. So next week, We'll get feedback from you. We'll play that here. And then the following week, we'll recap our field trip, which is happening June 7th with Iris and also with Tiersa McQueen. It's going to happen at 5:30 Eastern, 2:30 Pacific, 11:30 p.m. for our South Africa family. So the invite will be in the Fair of the Free Child Village first, and then on next week's show notes page. So you don't want to miss that. Make sure you're part of the village. The link will be on the show notes page. Make sure you subscribe or follow wherever you're listening to this podcast now. And we also will be putting the full episode on YouTube so that you can get the transcript. All right. As always, thank you for listening and chat to you next week.